Four luxury apartment towers, 34 floors each, multi-million dollar units with doormen, concierge, and skyline views of Manhattan. And not a single plaque, not one marker, nothing. Beneath those foundations, beneath the polished lobbies and underground parking garages, lies the ghost of what was once the eighth largest brewery in the United States. A complex of 27 buildings, 1,000 workers, 2 million barrels of beer a year, and a smell, hops, barley, malt, so thick it soaked into the walls of every home in Yorkville for 100 years. The man who built it didn't just build a brewery, he bought Babe Ruth, he built Yankee Stadium. He turned a losing baseball team into the most dominant franchise in American sports history. Then he died, and in less than 30 years, every single thing he built, the brewery, the baseball dynasty, the family empire, was gone. This is the story of Jacob Ruppert, a man who conquered 2 industries, won 10 World Series, and was forgotten by the very ground he stood on. 3 people, 1 factory, 1 dynasty. And the question that still has no clean answer: how does 100 years disappear in 30? In 1835, a young brewer from Bavaria stepped off a ship at the port of New York with nothing but a trade, a name, and the stubborn belief that what worked in Germany could work in America. His name was Franz Ruppert. New York in 1835 was loud, filthy, and electric with possibility. The city's population had just crossed 270,000, and it was growing faster than anyone could manage. Immigrants poured in from every corner of Europe. The Irish came fleeing poverty. The Italians came chasing work. And the Germans, tens of thousands of them, came bringing something specific: culture, language, music, and above all, beer. The German community that Franz stepped into wasn't a scattered handful of immigrants. It was a world unto itself. In lower Manhattan and spreading north into the neighborhoods that would become Yorkville, German-speaking New Yorkers built churches, newspapers, theaters, and beer halls. They called the area Kleindeutschland, Little Germany. On Sunday afternoons, families gathered in beer gardens along the East River, drinking lager the way back home taught them: slow, cold, in good company. Franz understood something that most people around him did not. Lager beer, the clean, cold-fermented style from Bavaria, was fundamentally different from the warm ales that English-speaking Americans were used to drinking. Lager required ice, it required patience, it required precision. Done right, it was smoother, cleaner, and far more drinkable than anything most New Yorkers had ever tasted. He started small, a malting operation in 1845, supplying raw materials to other brewers, learning the commercial landscape, building relationships. 5 years later, in 1850, he made his move. He purchased an existing brewery in the Turtle Bay section of Midtown East, a neighborhood named for the small cove that once cut into the Manhattan shoreline. He renamed it simply the Turtle Bay Brewery. It was not a grand operation, but it was his. Franz ran the Turtle Bay Brewery through the 1850s and into the 1860s, and during those years, something more important than the beer itself was taking shape. His son Jacob, born in 1842, raised in the smell of malt and the sound of rolling barrels, was growing up inside the business. Not as an observer, as a worker, as a student of every step in the process, from grain to glass. By the time Jacob was in his 20s, he wasn't just helping his father, he was running the place. In 1869, Franz sold the Turtle Bay Brewery to another brewer and stepped back from the business. He had built what he set out to build: a foothold, a foundation, a name. But the Ruppert story was not ending. It was only just beginning its second chapter, because Jacob Ruppert Sr. had already been planning his next move for years. In 1867, the same year his father was winding down, Jacob Ruppert Sr. secured a piece of land on 3rd Avenue between 91st and 92nd Streets in a neighborhood that was still more farmland than city block. He wasn't buying into an established district. He was betting on where New York was going to grow. It was a calculated gamble, and it paid off almost immediately. The Jacob Ruppert Brewery opened on that site in the summer of 1867. In its first year of operation, the brewery produced 5,000 barrels of beer. That number sounds modest by modern standards, but in the context of 1867 New York, where most breweries were small, local, and technologically primitive, 5,000 barrels in year one was a statement. Jacob Sr. was not interested in staying small. Through the 1870s and into the 1880s, the brewery expanded in almost every direction. A larger production facility in 1874, another expansion in 1877, a third in 1880. Each time, Jacob Sr. invested not just in size but in technology, including glass-lined steel tanks that were, at the time, at the absolute frontier of brewing science. Most brewers were still working with wooden barrels and open fermentation vessels. Ruppert's operation was producing beer with a consistency and purity that his competitors couldn't match. He also invested in ice. Lager beer requires cold fermentation and cold storage. This was the era before mechanical refrigeration, which meant ice houses were as critical to a brewery's operation as the brew kettles themselves. Ruppert built and operated several ice houses alongside the main plant, giving him a supply chain that most of his rivals simply didn't have. By the mid-1880s, the Jacob Ruppert Brewery was no longer a neighborhood operation. It was one of the largest and most sophisticated brewing facilities on the East Coast. And working inside it, learning every corner of the operation, was a young man who had been accepted into Columbia College and turned it down to wash barrels. Jacob Ruppert Jr. started at the bottom. Not symbolically, literally. 12-hour days, $10 a week. His hands in the same vats and hoses his grandfather Franz had built a life around. But Jacob Jr. wasn't just learning the beer business. He was studying something larger. How a man builds something that lasts. What his grandfather had started with a malting operation and a borrowed name, his father had turned into an institution. The question that would define the next 50 years of the Ruppert family was whether Jacob Jr. could take it further still. The answer would involve a congressman's seat, a baseball team, and a left-handed pitcher from Baltimore named George Herman Ruth. But that comes later. First, there was the beer to get right. There is a particular kind of man who is never satisfied with being good at one thing. Jacob Ruppert Jr. was that man. He had been accepted into Columbia College at 17. He turned it down. Not because he was lazy and not because he lacked the intelligence. Anyone who spent 5 minutes watching him work understood that. He turned it down because he had already decided that a classroom was the wrong place to learn what he needed to know. The brewery was his classroom. The loading docks were his lecture halls. The men who rolled barrels at 4 in the morning were his professors. He started as a barrel washer in 1887. 12-hour days, $10 a week. In a family that already owned one of the largest brewing operations on the East Coast, Jacob Jr. insisted on starting at the absolute bottom. And he meant it. No special treatment, no shortened shifts. He learned the physical language of the business before he ever touched a ledger or sat in a management meeting. It was a calculated decision, and it shaped everything that came after. By the early 1890s, Jacob Jr. had worked his way up to vice president and general manager of the brewery. But even as he was mastering the commercial side of the operation, supply chains, distribution networks, sales relationships across New York's 5 boroughs, he was simultaneously building a second identity entirely outside of beer. In 1886, at 19 years old, he enlisted as a private in the 7th Regiment of the New York National Guard. There was nothing unusual about a young man of his background joining the Guard. It was socially expected in certain circles of New York society. What was unusual was how fast he rose. By 1890, he had been promoted to colonel and appointed aide-de-camp to David B. Hill, the governor of New York. He later served in the same capacity under Governor Roswell P. Flower. The title stuck. For the rest of his life, at the brewery in Congress, in the owner's box at Yankee Stadium, everyone called him Colonel Ruppert. Not Mr., not Jacob, the Colonel. He wore it like a second skin, impeccably dressed, formally mannered with a slight but permanent German accent that never softened no matter how many decades he spent in New York. He spoke slowly, chose his words carefully, and had a habit of referring to himself in the third person during press interviews. The Colonel thinks, he would say, that this team has not yet reached its potential. It was not arrogance, or at least not only arrogance. It was the posture of a man who understood that image is infrastructure, that how people perceive you shapes what they allow you to build. In 1898, Jacob Ruppert Jr. ran for the United States House of Representatives as a Democrat in New York's 15th Congressional District. He defeated the Republican incumbent. Then he did it again, and again, and again. 4 consecutive terms in Congress from 1899 to 1907, representing a district that included much of the Upper East Side, including, not coincidentally, the neighborhoods surrounding his own brewery. He was not a transformative legislator. History does not remember him for landmark bills or floor speeches that changed the direction of the country. What he understood about politics was the same thing he understood about business. Relationships are the product. He built them carefully, maintained them strategically, and cashed them in only when the return was worth the investment. By 1907, he had decided Congress had given him what he needed from it. He walked away and returned his full attention to the brewery, arriving at a moment when the operation was on the edge of something extraordinary. In 1916, Jacob Ruppert Jr., now effectively running the company alongside his aging father, oversaw the construction of an entirely new production facility. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible by the standards of the day. 2 million barrels per year, $30 million in investment, 1,000 workers on the payroll. The brew kettles installed that year were reported to be the largest in the world. The brewery now occupied 27 buildings, stretching from 90th to 94th Street, running between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. The smell of hops and malt drifted across Yorkville on still mornings. Residents who grew up in the neighborhood decades later would describe it not as an industrial odor, but as something closer to comfort, the smell of the place being alive and working. Walking those floors in the early 1910s, watching the operation he had helped scale from the inside, was a man in his mid-40s at the absolute peak of his professional power. Colonel, congressman, brewery president, president of the United States Brewers Association, and still not satisfied. Because there was one thing Jacob Ruppert Jr. had wanted since he was a boy, growing up on Fifth Avenue. One thing he had never been able to buy, despite having the money and the connections and the name to make almost any transaction happen. He wanted to own a baseball team. Specifically, he wanted to own a New York baseball team. He had tried to buy the Giants. Twice. Both times the answer was no. The Cubs had been offered to him in 1912, but Chicago was too far from home. He needed New York. He needed it the way some men need to finish a sentence. It was just how his mind was built. In 1914, the opportunity finally arrived, and it came as the best opportunities often do, wrapped in someone else's failure. Knickerbocker beer did not become the drink of New York because of advertising. It became the drink of New York because it was everywhere. Because if you walked into a bar in Brooklyn, a tavern in the Bronx, a corner saloon on the Lower East Side, or a restaurant on the Upper West Side, there it was, on tap, in bottles, on the menu board written in chalk above the register. Knickerbocker was not a premium product chasing a premium customer. It was a working beer for a working city, and Jacob Ruppert Jr. understood that the moment you started charging people extra for something they counted on, you stopped being a staple and started being a luxury. He never let that happen. The brewery's sales network by the early 1910s was one of the most sophisticated distribution operations in New York State. Ruppert's wagons, pulled first by horses, later by trucks, ran routes through every borough on a schedule precise enough that bar owners knew within 15 minutes when their delivery would arrive. When a keg ran dry on a Friday night, the replacement was there Saturday morning. That kind of reliability built loyalty that no advertisement could buy. The Knickerbocker name itself was chosen with care. It was the Old Dutch nickname for New York's earliest settlers, a word that meant home, history, belonging. Ruppert had refined the recipe from what his father had originally produced, smoothing the finish, adjusting the carbonation, calibrating it specifically to what New York's palate had come to expect from a cold lager on a hot afternoon. It was, by any measure, a beer designed for one city and one city only. And in Yorkville, where the brewery itself stood, the connection between the product and the place was total. Residents who grew up within blocks of the facility described the neighborhood not in terms of streets or landmarks, but in terms of smell. On brewing days, which was most days, the warm, yeasty scent of fermenting malt hung over the entire district from morning until well past dark. Children walked to school through it. Families ate dinner with the windows open to it. Old men sat on stoops in the evening and breathed it in the way people in other neighborhoods breathe in salt air or pine trees. It was not a smell they tolerated. It was a smell they belonged to. By 1913, that smell was coming from a complex of 27 buildings, running nearly 4 city blocks in every direction. The operation was the economic backbone of Yorkville, providing steady employment to 1,000 workers, most of them from the German, Irish, and Eastern European immigrant communities that made up the neighborhood's fabric. Among them, the grandson of the first Irish worker who had ever pulled a shift at the Ruppert facility. His grandfather had come in through the original gate on 3rd Avenue in the late 1860s, hired on the spot by Jacob Sr. himself. His father had worked the bottling line for 30 years, and now he was here too, on the loading dock, moving crates of Knickerbocker into delivery trucks before the sun came up, carrying forward a family connection to this place that was as old as the brewery itself. He didn't think of himself as part of history. He thought of himself as a man with a good job and a steady wage. That was enough, for now. In January 1915, Jacob Ruppert Sr. died. He had built the brewery from a patch of land on 3rd Avenue into one of the most productive industrial operations in New York City. He had taken his own father's immigrant hustle, France's malting business, France's Turtle Bay gamble, and turned it into an institution. The estate he left behind was valued at just over $6 million. For a man who had started with nothing but a German accent and a knowledge of fermentation, it was a staggering sum. Jacob Jr. inherited the company and assumed the presidency. He was 47 years old. He had spent 30 years inside this business, working every level of it, expanding it, modernizing it, protecting it. He knew it better than anyone alive, and he immediately started spending its money on something that had nothing to do with beer. On December 31st, 1914, just weeks before his father's death, Jacob Ruppert Jr. and his partner, Captain Tillinghast Lomedai Houston, had quietly finalized the purchase of the New York Highlanders Baseball Club. The price was $480,000. The team they were buying had posted losing records in most of the previous decade. Their home games were played in a stadium they didn't own, as tenants of the Giants at the Polo Grounds. They had no star players, no identity, and no particular reason to inspire confidence. Ruppert bought them anyway. He immediately pushed to rename the team. His first choice was the Knickerbockers, the same name as his best-selling beer, a branding move that would have linked the two businesses in the minds of every sports fan in New York. The city's newspaper editors killed the idea before it went anywhere. The name was too long, they said. It wouldn't fit in a headline. The team needed something shorter, sharper, more printable. They settled on the Yankees. Ruppert was not sentimental about the loss of his preferred name. He was already thinking about something larger than what the team was called. He was thinking about what it could become, and what kind of player could make it become that. He had watched the baseball market the same way he watched the brewing market. He understood that the product was only as good as its best ingredient. In 1915, he didn't have that ingredient yet, but he was already looking. And 3 years later, pitching for the Boston Red Sox, a 23-year-old left-hander was putting up numbers that no one in the American League could explain or contain. He was young, he was loud, he was undisciplined off the field, and he could hit a baseball to places that made grown men stop and stare. His name was George Herman Ruth, and he was about to become the most expensive purchase Jacob Ruppert had ever made. More expensive than the Yankees themselves. More expensive than any single piece of equipment in the brewery. More expensive than anything the Ruppert family had ever written a check for. But that transaction, and what it cost and what it built, belongs to a different chapter. Because first, the lights were about to go out on the entire industry. On the morning of January 6, 1920, New Yorkers picked up their newspapers and read two things simultaneously. The first was that the United States Supreme Court had voted 5-4 to uphold the Volstead Act, the legislation that defined the legal teeth of prohibition and set the alcohol content threshold for what the federal government considered an intoxicating beverage at 0.5%. The second was the name of the man who had argued the other side of that case all the way to the highest court in the country, Jacob Ruppert. He had not gone quietly. Representing the United States Brewers Association, Ruppert had challenged Congress's constitutional authority to define what constituted an intoxicating drink, specifically targeting the government's classification of beer with 2.75% alcohol content as legally equivalent to hard spirits. It was a reasonable argument on its merits. It was also a losing one. The court dismissed his petition without ceremony, and with that ruling, the 18th Amendment, ratified exactly 1 year earlier, had all the enforcement authority it needed. At midnight on January 17, 1920, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquor became illegal across the United States. The Ruppert Brewery did not close its doors that night, but everyone inside it understood that the world they had built over 50 years had just been reclassified as a criminal enterprise. The scale of what prohibition meant for an operation like Ruppert's is difficult to overstate. This was not a small craft brewery that could pivot overnight or quietly find another revenue stream. This was 27 buildings, 1,000 workers, a distribution network that spanned every borough of New York City and reached into New Jersey, Connecticut, and beyond. The infrastructure alone, the kettles, the tanks, the ice houses, the delivery fleet, represented decades of capital investment. You could not simply mothball it and wait for sanity to return. Ruppert tried to fight it in court. He lost. He tried to fight it in the press. He was largely ignored. He tried to fight it through the Brewers Association, lobbying for a legal beer threshold that would at least allow low-alcohol beverages to remain on the market. The Supreme Court had just answered that question definitively, so he adapted. The brewery retooled its production lines to manufacture near beer, a de-alcoholized malt beverage that met the federal threshold and tasted, by most honest accounts, like a reasonable approximation of nothing in particular. They also pivoted into soft drinks, producing a line of carbonated beverages under the Ruppert name. They sold ice. They sold malt syrup, ostensibly for baking purposes, though everyone involved understood exactly what most customers were doing with it at home. It was not dignified. For a man who had spent 30 years building one of the most respected brewing operations in the country, selling near beer and ice to survive felt like being asked to race a thoroughbred in a harness. But Ruppert did it without public complaint. The colonel kept his composure. The bills got paid. The workers, most of them kept their jobs. Most of them, not all. For the men who had built their lives around the actual business of selling beer, prohibition did not offer a graceful transition. In the saloons and taverns of Yorkville, the night of January 17, 1920 arrived with the particular heaviness of something ending that everyone had hoped until the very last moment might not actually end. Bar owners drained their legal stock. Regulars sat at their usual stools and drank with the focused attention of men saying goodbye to an old friend. And then the doors opened the next morning onto a different world. One of those men, a Ruppert Brewery sales representative who had worked the Yorkville and Upper East Side route for 11 years, came into the office on January 18th expecting to be told what his new assignment would be. Instead, he was handed a severance envelope and shown the door. The near beer operation didn't need a sales force calibrated for 100 accounts a week. It needed a skeleton crew and a lot of patience. He was 34 years old with a wife, 2 children, and a mortgage on a 2-bedroom apartment 4 blocks from the brewery. He had never worked anywhere else. The Ruppert name on his weekly paycheck had felt for 11 years like permanence itself. He found work eventually, a delivery job with a dry goods company on the west side. The pay was worse. The hours were longer, but he adapted the way working people have always adapted when the ground shifts beneath them. Not because it was easy, but because the alternative was worse. What is worth noting is that his experience was not exceptional. It was the standard. Across New York City, the brewery and saloon industry had employed tens of thousands of workers. Coopers, drivers, bartenders, bottlers, accountants, stevedores, stable hands. Prohibition did not just ban a beverage. It erased an entire economic ecosystem overnight and replaced it with nothing. Ruppert understood this. It was part of why he had fought so hard in court and why he continued quietly through industry channels, to lobby for the amendment's repeal throughout the 1920s. He was not a man given to sentimentality, but he was a man given to loyalty. The workers who had built his brewery deserved better than what Washington had handed them. He could not give them that. What he could do, and what he did with a methodical intensity that defined everything he touched, was keep the operation alive long enough for the political winds to shift. And while he waited, he had a baseball team to run. In the winter of 1919, with Prohibition freshly installed and his brewery operating at a fraction of its former capacity, Jacob Ruppert authorized the single transaction that would define his legacy more than any barrel of Knickerbocker ever could. He reached across the negotiating table to the owner of the Boston Red Sox, a man named Harry Frazee, who needed cash badly enough to sell something he had no business selling, and he agreed to terms on the contract of Babe Ruth. The number would come later. What mattered first was the decision, and the decision was pure Ruppert. Identify the best asset available, move before anyone else does, and pay whatever it takes to close the deal. He had run his brewery on exactly that principle for 30 years. Now he was about to apply it to baseball, and in doing so, he would build something that made even the eighth largest brewery in America look, by comparison, like a very small operation indeed. The number was $100,000. In January 1920, that figure represented more money than any baseball player had ever been sold for in the history of the sport. It was more than twice the previous record. It was, at the time, a sum large enough to purchase a decent-sized office building in Midtown Manhattan, or to fund an entire season of minor league operations for several clubs simultaneously. It was, by any rational measure, an obscene amount of money to spend on a 24-year-old pitcher who had recently decided he preferred hitting to pitching. Jacob Ruppert wrote the check anyway. The man on the other side of the transaction was Harry Frazee, owner of the Boston Red Sox, a Broadway theater producer who needed cash to finance his next production and had made the catastrophic miscalculation of deciding that his best baseball player was more liquid than his real estate holdings. Frazee had won the World Series with Ruth in 1918. He sold him 18 months later for a personal loan and a mortgage on Fenway Park. Boston would not win another World Series for 86 years. Ruth arrived in New York in the winter of 1920 like something the city had been waiting for without knowing it. He was large in every direction, physically, emotionally, appetitively. He ate too much, drank too much, stayed out too late, and showed up the next afternoon and hit the baseball so hard and so far that none of it seemed to matter. Ruppert, who was by temperament and personal habit the precise opposite of everything Ruth represented, understood immediately what he had purchased. Not a ball player, a phenomenon. In his first season as a Yankee, Ruth hit 54 home runs, shattering his own major league record of 29, which he had set the previous year in Boston. The Yankees, who had finished in third place in 1919, drew more than 1 million fans to the Polo Grounds in 1920. They had never drawn 1 million fans before. They would never draw fewer again. Ruppert watched all of this from his owner's box with the satisfaction of a man whose investment thesis had just been validated in real time. But he was already thinking about the next problem. The Yankees were tenants in a stadium they didn't own, playing on the Giants' field, drawing crowds that embarrassed their landlords. The Giants' management made clear, with increasing sharpness, that the arrangement was no longer acceptable. Ruppert's response was characteristically direct. If they needed their own stadium, he would build them one. Construction on Yankee Stadium began in May 1922 on a plot of land in the South Bronx across the Harlem River from the Polo Grounds. The site covered more than 10 acres. The design called for a triple-deck grandstand capable of holding over 58,000 spectators, the largest baseball facility ever built at that point in American history. It cost $2.5 million and was completed in less than a year. Yankee Stadium opened on April 18, 1923. Babe Ruth hit a home run in the third inning. The newspapers called it the house that Ruth built. It was a good line. But the more precise formulation, the one that history has never quite settled on, is that it was the house that beer money built. Every dollar that had ever come out of the Ruppert Brewery, every barrel of Knickerbocker that had ever rolled off a delivery truck in Brooklyn or Queens, every near beer sold during Prohibition just to keep the lights on. All of it had been flowing for years toward this moment. The Colonel stood in his box on opening day, impeccably dressed as always, and watched 58,000 people fill the building he had paid for. He did not smile easily, but he smiled that afternoon. What followed over the next 15 years was the construction of the most dominant sports franchise in American history, assembled by a man whose primary business was still, technically, brewing beer. Ruth was the foundation, but Ruppert understood that foundations alone don't win championships. You need structure, you need depth, you need the right people making the right decisions at every level of the organization. He hired Miller Huggins as manager, a small, quiet man who had the singular ability to impose discipline on a clubhouse that included Babe Ruth, which was roughly equivalent to imposing discipline on a natural disaster. Huggins and Ruth despised each other for years. The Yankees won 3 consecutive World Series anyway, in 1923, 1927, and 1928. Then Ruppert went back to work on the roster. Lou Gehrig had been playing first base for the Yankees since 1923, quietly and methodically building what would become one of the greatest careers in baseball history. Where Ruth was spectacle, Gehrig was substance. A man who showed up every single day and performed with a consistency that made him, in some ways, more valuable than the star everyone came to see. Ruppert recognized this early. He paid Gehrig accordingly. Joe DiMaggio arrived in 1936, 21 years old, from San Francisco, the son of a fisherman, with a hitting stroke so elegant that sports writers ran out of adjectives trying to describe it. DiMaggio's first season, the Yankees won the World Series. His second season, they won it again. His third, they won it a third consecutive time. By the late 1930s, the Yankees had won 7 World Series championships. They had become not just the best team in baseball, but the standard against which all other teams measured themselves. The definition of what a franchise could be if it was built with intelligence, patience, and sufficient capital. All of which raises the question that a reporter for Time magazine finally asked Ruppert directly in 1932 in an interview that has become one of the small, perfect documents of the era. The reporter asked whether winning baseball championships represented the greatest thrill of his life. Ruppert thought about it. Then he said, "Looking back now, I doubt if I ever felt more elated than when I was a youngster, and on occasion would go galloping out, driving the ambulance to bring in one of our ailing brewery wagon horses. Those brewery teams were as pretty to see operate as a nicely stepping ball team." It is, on the surface, an eccentric answer. A man who had bought Babe Ruth, built Yankee Stadium, and won multiple World Series championships. And the moment he identified as the peak of his emotional life was rescuing a sick horse from the street. But sit with it longer, and something else emerges. What Ruppert was describing was not nostalgia for horses. He was describing the feeling of something he had built, something that depended on him, something he was responsible for, needing him and him being there to answer. The brewery was not just a business to him. It was a living system, with workers and animals and rhythms and loyalties. And he had loved it the way you love something you have cared for from the beginning. The Yankees were magnificent. The championships were real. But the brewery was where he had started with his hands in a barrel at 5 in the morning, and nothing. Not Babe Ruth, not Yankee Stadium, not 10 World Series rings, had ever fully replaced the feeling of that. He would carry that with him for the rest of his life, which by 1938 was not very much longer. By the autumn of 1938, Jacob Ruppert Jr. had begun to look like a man who was running out of time and knew it. He had been diagnosed with phlebitis, a chronic inflammation of the veins that had plagued him for years, and was now accelerating with the particular cruelty of illnesses that wait until a man has slowed down before announcing themselves fully. He moved with difficulty. He tired quickly. The daily routines that had structured his life for half a century, the early mornings at the brewery, the afternoon visits to the stadium, the precise, unhurried attention he gave to every decision in both operations, were becoming harder to sustain. He sustained them anyway, for as long as he could. Those who worked closely with him during those final months described a man who had not softened with illness, but had somehow distilled. The surface impatience was gone. What remained was something quieter and more concentrated. A man who had decided, consciously or not, that the time remaining was too valuable to spend on anything that wasn't essential. He reviewed contracts. He approved personnel decisions. He sat in his office at the brewery and listened to reports from the floor managers with the same focused attention he had given them 30 years earlier. He was doing what he had always done. He was working. On the afternoon of January 9, 1939, Jacob Ruppert was admitted to his townhouse on Fifth Avenue, the same street where he had grown up as a boy, in the house his father had built with brewery money, on the block where the Ruppert name had meant something since before the Civil War. He was 71 years old. The doctors who attended him in those final days were careful in their language, but the people closest to him understood what the careful language meant. There would be no recovery. What happened in that townhouse over the following 4 days has been described by various accounts with varying degrees of sentimentality, and it is worth being precise about what is documented and what is not. What is documented is this. Several members of the Yankees organization came to pay their respects in those final days, and the radio in the adjacent room was kept on, tuned to whatever was broadcasting. Ruppert had spent 40 years making decisions based on information, box scores, production numbers, market reports, and even at the end, the habit held. He wanted to know what was happening in the world outside the room. What is also documented is that Babe Ruth, by then retired from baseball, his playing career finished, his relationship with the organization complicated by years of contract disputes and personality clashes with management, came to Fifth Avenue to see the man who had brought him to New York 19 years earlier. Ruth was not a man given to quiet. He filled rooms the way he filled ballparks, with noise, with presence, with an energy that made stillness seem like an oversight. But by the accounts of those present, when he entered Ruppert's room and saw the colonel in the condition he was in, Ruth went quiet. He sat. He stayed for a while. He left without saying much of anything that anyone later thought worth recording. Sometimes the significant moments are the ones where nothing is said. Jacob Ruppert Jr. died on January 13, 1939. The obituaries ran on the front pages of every major newspaper in New York City, and most of them led with the Yankees. That was understandable. The Yankees were famous in a way the brewery never was. Famous the way things become famous when they win repeatedly and publicly in front of 50,000 people at a time. But those who had known Ruppert longest, who had watched him move through the brewery floors in the early mornings, talking to workers by name, checking temperatures on the fermentation tanks with his own hands, understood that the newspapers had the emphasis slightly wrong. The brewery was first. It was always first. The Yankees were what he built with the money and the discipline the brewery had taught him. The brewery was where the discipline came from. Consider the arithmetic of a single life's work. When Jacob Ruppert Sr. died in 1915, he left behind an estate valued at just over $6 million, the accumulated wealth of nearly 5 decades of building one of the most productive brewing operations on the East Coast. It was, by any measure, a remarkable achievement for the son of a Bavarian immigrant who had started with a malting operation in a borrowed name. Jacob Jr. took that $6 million and spent the next 24 years turning it into $120 million, 20 times over, in less than a quarter century. Through Prohibition, through the Depression, through 2 decades of operating in an industry that had been legally abolished and then slowly, partially, imperfectly restored. Through all of it, Jacob Ruppert Jr. had kept moving, buying, building, expanding, hiring, never standing still long enough for the ground to shift beneath him without his noticing. $120 million in 1939. The number is staggering even before you adjust it for inflation. After you adjust it, it becomes something closer to a miracle. And he left all of it to people who did not know what to do with it. There is no gentle way to say this. The Ruppert heirs, the nephews and nieces and distant family members who divided the estate, were not equipped for what they inherited. This was not their fault exactly. Very few people are equipped to inherit an empire from a man who spent his entire life becoming the only person capable of running it. The institutional knowledge that Jacob Ruppert Jr. carried, The relationships, the instincts, the precise calibration of when to push and when to hold could not be bequeathed in a will. It lived in him, and it died with him. His brother George, who had served as vice president of the Yankees organization, was offered the team's presidency after Jacob's death. He declined, not out of indifference, but out of honest self-assessment. George Ruppert knew he was not the man for the job. He recommended instead that Ed Barrow, the general manager, take operational control. It was a reasonable suggestion, and Barrow managed to hold the dynasty together long enough to win one more World Series in 1939 and two more in the early 1940s. But the structure was weakening at its foundations. On the loading dock of the Ruppert Brewery, the grandson of the first Irish worker who had ever taken a shift at the facility was still showing up before sunrise. He had been there long enough to remember what the operation felt like under the colonel's ownership. The particular tension of a place that was always being pushed slightly beyond its current capacity, always being asked to do a little more than it had done the month before. That tension was gone now. What replaced it was harder to name. Not laziness, not incompetence, something more like drift. The feeling of a ship whose captain had left the bridge and whose crew was managing, professionally and conscientiously, to maintain speed without anyone being entirely sure of the heading. He noticed it in small things at first. Decisions that used to be made in a day now took a week. Equipment that would have been upgraded without discussion under the old ownership was left to run past its useful life. The sales relationships that Ruppert had built personally, the handshakes and the history and the particular weight that the colonel's name had carried in a room, were not transferable to men who had not built them. It would take years for the consequences to become visible, but the drift had already begun. Jacob Ruppert Jr. was buried at the family mausoleum in Kensico Cemetery in Westchester County, beneath a stone that bore only the name and the dates. No titles, no achievements, no mention of the brewery or the Yankees or Babe Ruth or Yankee Stadium or any of the 10,000 decisions that had made him one of the most consequential private citizens New York had produced in the first half of the 20th century. Just the name, just the years. It was, in its own way, exactly how he would have wanted it. The colonel had never been a man who needed the marker to explain the man. The work was supposed to do that. For a while it did. There is a particular kind of institutional collapse that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a single catastrophic decision, a dramatic boardroom confrontation, or a front-page scandal. It arrives quietly in the accumulation of small failures. The delayed maintenance, the missed opportunity, the relationship not tended to, the standard quietly lowered until no one can quite remember what the standard used to be. It looks from the outside like an organization still functioning. And it is still functioning, just not the way it was built to function. That was the Ruppert Brewery after 1939. The men who inherited the operation were not villains. They were not corrupt or negligent in any obvious prosecutable sense. They were simply not Jacob Ruppert Jr., and in an institution that had been built so completely around one man's vision, judgment, and personal authority. Not being that man turned out to be disqualifying in ways that took years to fully surface. The first visible crack came not from the brewery, but from the Yankees. Within 6 years of Ruppert's death, the most successful sports franchise in American history had been sold. The heirs, facing the complexity of managing an asset they neither fully understood nor particularly wanted, accepted an offer from a group led by Dan Topping, Del Webb, and Larry MacPhail in January 1945. The sale price was $2,800,000, a number that represented a modest profit over what Ruppert had originally paid and an almost incomprehensible undervaluation of what the franchise had become under his ownership. Ruppert had spent 24 years turning a losing baseball team into a dynasty worth many times that figure. His heirs spent 6 years turning it back into a transaction. The workers inside the brewery understood what the Yankees sale meant, even if no one said it directly. An asset that Ruppert had treated as an extension of his identity, something to be built, protected, and passed forward, had been converted into liquidity. The brewery itself had not been sold, but the logic that had governed the Ruppert enterprise under the colonel, the logic that said you build things for the long run, that you invest ahead of need, that you maintain relationships because relationships are the business. That logic had just been publicly abandoned. On the loading dock, the man who had worked those floors since before the colonel's death watched the news move through the facility the way bad news always moves through a workplace. In lowered voices, in exchanged glances, in the particular silence that falls when people understand that something has changed but cannot yet say exactly what. He kept loading trucks. There was still beer to move. For now. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the brewery continued operating, producing Knickerbocker beer, maintaining its distribution network, keeping the lights on across the Yorkville facility. From the outside, it looked like continuity. From the inside, it felt like managed decline. The American beer market was changing in ways that required exactly the kind of decisive, capital-intensive response that the Ruppert heirs were temperamentally and financially unwilling to make. National brands Budweiser, Pabst, Schlitz were investing heavily in television advertising, modernizing their production facilities, and building distribution networks that reached across state lines and eventually across the country. They were not competing on neighborhood loyalty. They were competing on scale, and scale required investment that the post-Ruppert management was unwilling to authorize. Knickerbocker beer had always been a New York product for New York people. That had been its strength under Ruppert, the specificity of it, the rootedness of it, the way it carried the weight of place and history in a way that a national brand never could. But specificity in a market moving rapidly toward consolidation was becoming a liability. The saloons and taverns of Yorkville were changing. The neighborhood itself was changing. The heavily German-American community that had grown up alongside the brewery, the people for whom Knickerbocker was not just a beer, but a piece of local identity, was dispersing into the suburbs, replaced by residents with different loyalties and different habits. The brewery's market share contracted steadily through the 1950s, not catastrophically, not all at once, but with the relentless arithmetic of a business that is spending more than it is growing. Equipment aged past its optimal life. Key personnel retired and were replaced with less experienced staff. The sales relationships that Ruppert had personally cultivated, built on decades of handshakes and kept promises, and the particular credibility that came from being the colonel's representative, could not be transferred to a new generation of salesmen working for an organization that no longer projected the same authority. By the early 1960s, the conclusion was becoming unavoidable. On December 31st, 1965, the Jacob Ruppert Brewery closed its doors for the final time. The Knickerbocker brand was sold to the Rheingold Corporation, a transaction that preserved the name while stripping it of everything that had ever made the name mean something. A beer called Knickerbocker would continue to exist in the New York market for a few more years, brewed by people who had no connection to Yorkville, to Third Avenue, to the man who had refined its recipe and built its identity over 40 years. It was the brand without the soul, the label without the story. The man on the loading dock, now in his late 50s, gray-haired, 25 years into a job that no longer existed, walked out of the Ruppert facility on that last day of 1965 and did not look back. He had learned that from the brewery itself in the years when it was still worth learning from. You do not waste time mourning what is already finished. You find the next thing, you show up, you do the work. The brewery had taught him that. Whatever else it had failed to preserve, it had managed to pass that much forward. In 1969, 4 years after the last barrel of Knickerbocker rolled out of the Yorkville facility, the demolition crews arrived on 3rd Avenue. It took months to bring down what had taken a century to build. The 27 buildings that had once constituted one of the most productive industrial complexes in New York City came down in sections. The brew houses first, then the storage facilities, then the administrative buildings that had housed the offices where Jacob Ruppert Jr. had made the decisions that built two empires. The machinery had already been stripped and sold. The glass-lined steel tanks, the massive kettles, the ice storage infrastructure, all of it dispersed into the second-hand industrial market, absorbed by other operations in other cities, carrying no trace of where they had come from. The neighborhood watched it happen the way neighborhoods watch the demolition of familiar things, with a mixture of resignation and the particular disorientation that comes from seeing a piece of the permanent world reveal itself as temporary. For the residents of Yorkville who had grown up within range of the brewery's smell, who had walked to school through the warm yeast and malt mornings, who had oriented their internal geography around the hulking brick buildings on 3rd Avenue the way other people orient themselves around churches or parks, the demolition was not just the loss of a building, it was the loss of a sensory landmark. The smell was gone before the structures were. The day the brewery closed in 1965, the air in Yorkville began the slow process of becoming odorless. And by the time the wrecking crews finished their work in 1969, there was nothing left to indicate that the air had ever been anything else. On the cleared site, construction began on what would become Ruppert Yorkville Towers, 4 residential buildings, 34 stories each, completed in 1975. The complex was given the Ruppert name as a gesture toward historical acknowledgement. It was a thin gesture. There were no plaques on the lobby walls explaining who Ruppert was or what had stood on that ground before the foundations were poured. No architectural detail, no preserved artifact, no interpretive marker of any kind connected the towers to the brewery or to the family whose century of work had made the land valuable enough to build on. The name was there. The history was not. Across town, in the South Bronx, Yankee Stadium told a different story. Monument Park, the section of the stadium dedicated to the organization's most significant figures, carried a plaque for Jacob Ruppert that described him as a gentleman, American sportsman, and credited his vision with the creation of the stadium itself. Players and coaches passed it before every home game. Tourists photographed it. The institutional memory of the Yankees had made space for the man who built it. The institutional memory of the brewery had not made space for anything. Among the first residents to move into Ruppert Yorkville Towers in the mid-1970s was a young woman whose grandfather had sold Knickerbocker beer out of a distribution depot 2 blocks away for most of his working life. She had chosen the apartment for the location, close to the subway, reasonable rent, good light in the mornings. She did not know when she signed the lease that the parking structure beneath her building occupied the precise footprint of the fermentation facility where her grandfather's career had begun. She lived there for 11 years. She never knew. That is what the end of an empire looks like, most of the time. Not a dramatic last stand, not a reckoning, just a woman in an apartment, living above a history she was never told, breathing air that used to smell like something and no longer does. On East 92nd Street, between 2nd and 3rd Avenues, there is a parking garage. It is not a remarkable parking garage. It has the standard features of its kind: fluorescent lighting, painted concrete columns, the particular smell of oil and exhaust that accumulates in enclosed spaces over decades. Cars move in and out of it on a daily schedule that has nothing to do with history and everything to do with the mundane arithmetic of Manhattan real estate. But if you walk far enough into it, past the ticket booth, past the first row of parked cars, past the point where most people stop and turn around, you will find hanging on the back wall a series of large color photographs. They are not labeled. There is no placard, no explanatory text, no institutional voice telling you what you are looking at or why it matters. You have to already know. The photographs show the Ruppert Brewery at the height of its operation, the massive brick buildings stretching across the block, the delivery trucks lined up along 3rd Avenue, the brew kettles that a 1915 newspaper reported were the largest in the world. And in one of them, standing beside Babe Ruth with the composed, slightly formal posture of a man who has never found a reason to be casual, is Colonel Jacob Ruppert, Jr. He is wearing a dark suit. He is not smiling exactly, but there is something in his expression that reads unmistakably as satisfaction. A man who built exactly what he set out to build, looking at the evidence of it. In 2013, 74 years after his death, Jacob Ruppert was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. The honor was real and the recognition was deserved, but it is worth noting what the Hall of Fame chose to remember him for. Not the brewery, not the Knickerbocker brand, not the 1,000 workers whose livelihoods he sustained through prohibition and depression, and the slow, grinding economic dislocations of the early 20th century. Not the ice houses or the glass-lined tanks, or the 50 years of technical innovation that made the Ruppert operation one of the most sophisticated brewing facilities in the country. He was remembered for the Yankees, for Ruth and Gehrig and DiMaggio and the stadium across the river. The baseball was magnificent, but it was the beer that made the baseball possible. And the beer has been largely forgotten by everyone except the people who grew up close enough to smell it. Somewhere in New York City, there is a craft brewery that produces a beer called Knickerbocker. The label carries a version of the old branding, an echo of the design that appeared on bottles delivered across every borough of New York for nearly 100 years. The beer inside the bottle is fine. It is made with care by people who understand the history they are invoking and treat it with appropriate respect. But it is not the same beer. It cannot be. The beer that came out of the Ruppert Brewery on 3rd Avenue was inseparable from the place that made it. From the Yorkville neighborhood, from the 1,000 workers who showed up before sunrise, from the specific chemistry of the water and the air, and the century of accumulated knowledge that lived in the hands of the men who ran the fermentation tanks. You cannot bottle that. You cannot sell it. When it is gone completely. What remains is the name. And names without the stories attached to them are just sounds. Jacob Ruppert built 2 empires and was remembered for one. He started with a barrel and $10 a week and ended with $120 million and a dynasty. He was a colonel who never led troops into battle, a congressman who never changed a law, a baseball owner who never played the game. And he understood all 3 worlds better than most of the people who had been born into them. He was also a man who, when asked the greatest thrill of his life, described driving a horse ambulance through the streets of Yorkville. That tells you something important. Not about the horses, about what it means to build something you love and be present for every part of it. The grand moments and the ordinary ones, the championships and the early mornings, the barrel washing and the billion-dollar transactions. Ruppert did not love what he built because it was large. He loved it because it was his, because he had put his hands into it from the beginning and never fully taken them out. The parking garage on 92nd Street closes at midnight. The photographs stay up all night in the dark, with no one to look at them. 92nd Street does not smell like beer anymore, but every time the Yankees win, somewhere in the upper deck, in the bleachers, in the standing room sections where the working people of New York have always watched baseball, someone raises a cold beer and drinks without thinking about where it came from, or who built the stadium around them, or what used to stand on a block 12 miles away that smelled on still mornings like the city itself was alive and fermenting. Jacob Ruppert would have understood that completely. He would not have needed the plaque.